chapter for the last of the spirits. The ghost came closer in a slow, serious and quiet way. When it was near Scrooge, he bent down on his knee because the spirit seemed to spread darkness and mystery throughout the air it moved in. The thing was covered in a dark black cloth that hid its head, face, and body, leaving only one hand visible. If it weren't for the hand, it would be hard to see the figure in the dark night. He felt scared when the tall and serious spirit stood next to him. The spirit didn't say or do anything, but its mysterious presence made him feel even more afraid. He didn't know what to do. Scrooge said, "I see the ghost of Christmas yet to come here with me." The ghost didn't reply, but it showed the way with its hand. "Are you going to show me things that haven't happened yet, but will happen soon?" asked Scrooge. "Is that what you mean, spirit?" The top part of the clothing briefly tightened as if the spirit had nodded its head. That was the only response he got. Even though Scrooge was used to being around ghosts, he was very scared of this particular ghost. It was so sparey that his legs were shaking and he could hardly stand up. However, the ghost stopped for a moment and waited for Scrooge to recover before they continued on together. But Scrooge felt even worse because of this. It scared him in a mysterious and uncertain way to realize that there were ghostly eyes staring at him from behind the dark cloth, while he could only see a ghostly hand and a large pile of blackness, even though he tried to see more. "Oh no, the ghost of the future," he said. "You scare me more than any ghost I've ever seen. But I understand that you're here to help me, and I want to change myself for the better. I'm ready to follow you and do whatever you ask of me, with gratitude. Can you please talk to me?" The hand was pointing straight ahead, and it didn't answer him. Scrooge said, "Go ahead. Go ahead. The night is ending quickly, and it's important time for me, I know. Go ahead, spirit." The ghost went away in the same way it had come toward Scrooge. Scrooge followed the ghost's shadowy dress, which he believed was carrying him along. They hardly appeared to go into the city. It was more like the city arose around them and surrounded them on its own. But they were actually in the center of it, at change, among the traders who rushed around, jingling the money in their pockets, talking in groups, checking their watches, and playing with their large gold seals in a thoughtful manner, just as Scrooge had seen them do many times before. The ghost stopped next to a group of businessmen. Scrooge noticed that the ghost was pointing towards them, so he moved closer to hear their conversation. "I don't know much about it," said a very big man with a huge chin, "but what I do know is that he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "What was wrong with him?" asked a third person, taking a lot of snuff from a big snuff box. "I didn't think he would ever die." "I don't know," said the first person while yawning. A man with a red face and a hanging lump on the end of his nose, which shook like a turkey's throat, asked, "What did he do with his money?" "I don't know," said the man with the big chin, yawning again. "Maybe he left it to his company." "He didn't leave it to me." "That's everything I know." Everyone laughed when they heard the pleasant remark. The speaker said that the funeral is probably going to be very inexpensive because they don't know anyone who would attend. They suggested forming a group and volunteering to attend the funeral. The man with the growth on his nose said, "I don't care if I go as long as they provide lunch. But I need to eat if I attend." Another laugh. "I am the least interested among all of you," said the first person, "because I never wear black gloves and I never have lunch. But I'll volunteer to go if someone else will." Actually, now that I think about it, I might have been his closest friend because we always stopped and talked whenever we saw each other. Goodbye. The people who were speaking and listening walked away and joined other groups. Scrooge recognized the men and turned to the spirit to understand what was happening. The ghost moved silently into a street. It pointed its finger towards two people who were meeting. Scrooge listened once more, hoping that he might find an explanation there. He knew these men very well. They were successful businessmen who were very rich and important. He always made sure to have a good relationship with them, but only in terms of business. "How are you?" said one. "How are you?" returned the other. "Hey," said the first person. "Looks like Old Scratch finally got what he deserved, right?" The second person replied, "That's what I was told." "It's chilly, right? Is it Christmas time now? Do you not know how to skate?" No, let's think of something else." "Good morning." They didn't say anything else. That was how they met, talked, and said goodbye. Scrooge was surprised at first that the ghost seemed to attach importance to conversations that appeared trivial. However, he was certain that there must be a hidden purpose behind them. The conversations were unlikely to have any connection to the death of Jacob, his old partner, as that was in the past and this ghost was focused on the future. Scrooge could not think of anyone immediately connected to himself to whom these conversations could apply. Nonetheless, he was convinced that they contained a hidden moral that could help him improve himself. He decided to remember every word he heard and everything he saw, especially when the shadow of himself appeared. He expected that observing the conduct of his future self would provide him with the clue he needed to solve these riddles easily. He searched for his reflection in that spot, but someone else was standing there instead. Even though it was the usual time for him to be there, he didn't see his own image among the many people entering through the entrance. He wasn't very surprised, though, because he had been thinking about changing his life and believed that he saw his new decisions being put into action here. It was quiet and dark, and the phantom stood beside him with its hand stretched out. When he stopped thinking deeply, he thought that the unseen eyes were looking at him closely because of the way the hand was positioned. This scared him and made him feel very cold. They left the busy area and went to a part of the town that Scrooge had never been to before. However, he knew where it was and that it had a bad reputation. The streets were dirty and narrow, and the shops and houses were in poor condition. The people there were dressed poorly and some were drunk. The alleys and archways smelled bad and were full of dirt and garbage. The whole area was filled with crime, dirt, and unhappiness. In this bad part of town, there was a small shop under a sloping roof where old things like metal, rags, bottles, bones, and greasy waste were bought. Inside, there were piles of old keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and all kinds of junk. Secrets that few people would want to know about were kept hidden in piles of dirty rags, piles of spoiled fat, and piles of bones. A gray-haired man, who was almost 70 years old, sat among the things he sold. He stayed warm with a charcoal stove made from old bricks, and he had covered himself with a bunch of old rags to keep out the cold air. He smoked his pipe in peace and quiet. Scrooge and the Phantom met a man in a shop while a woman carrying a heavy bundle sneaked in. Shortly after, another woman with a similar load came in, followed closely by a man in faded black. They were all surprised to see each other, but after a brief moment of confusion, they all laughed together, including the old man with the pipe. "Stop and let the cleaning lady go first," she shouted, the one who had arrived first. "Let the laundry worker go second, and let the assistant from the funeral home go third. Hey, old Joe, look at this opportunity. It seems like the three of us have met here by chance." Old Joe took his pipe out of his mouth and said, "You couldn't have met in a better place." He invited them into the parlor, telling them that they were welcome there because they had been there before, and the other two people were not strangers. He asked them to wait while he closed the door of the shop, which made a loud, rusty noise. He laughed and said that everything was old in the shop, including his bones. He thought they were all well suited for their jobs. Finally, he repeated his invitation for them to come into the parlor. The room behind the rag screen was called the parlor. An elderly man used an old stair rod to gather the fire together. It was night time, so he adjusted his smoky lamp using the stem of his pipe and put the pipe back in his mouth. As he was doing that, the lady who had spoken before threw her bag on the ground and sat on a stool in a way that showed off, with her arms crossed on her knees, and stared boldly and confidently at the other two. "What does it matter? What does it matter, Mrs. Dilber?" asked the woman. "Everyone has the right to take care of themselves." "He always did." "That's right, absolutely," said the person who washes clothes. "No one is more right." "Why are you just standing there and looking scared, woman? Who benefits from that? Let's not criticize each other, okay?" "We definitely shouldn't," said Mrs. Dilber and the man at the same time. "Great. Okay," shouted the woman. "That's sufficient. Who's affected by the loss of some items like these? No one, right?" "No, no," said Mrs. Dilber, laughing. The woman continued, "If he wanted to keep them after he died, he must have been a mean old man. Why didn't he behave kindly when he was alive? If he had, someone would have taken care of him when he was dying, instead of him being left all alone, struggling for his last breath." Mrs. Dilber said, "It's the most truthful word ever spoken. It's a punishment for him." "I wanted a harsher punishment," said the woman. "If I had something else, I would have used it. Old Joe, please open that bundle and tell me how much it's worth. Don't hesitate, just be honest. I'm not afraid to be the first one to see it, and I'm not afraid for others to see it either. I think we all knew we were taking things for ourselves before we got here, so it's not a big deal. Please open the bundle, Joe." But her friends were too kind to let her do it alone. A man wearing old black clothes climbed over the broken wall first and brought out his loot. It wasn't much, just a couple of seals, a pencil case, a pair of cufflinks, and an inexpensive brooch. Old Joe inspected each item carefully and decided how much he was willing to pay for them. He wrote down the prices on the wall and added them up to get the final amount since there was nothing else left. "That's your account," Joe said. "I wouldn't give any more money, even if someone threatened me." "Who's next?" Next in line was Mrs. Dilber. She had sheets, towels, some clothes that were a bit worn out, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her bill was displayed on the wall in the same way. "I always give too much to women. It's a weakness of mine and it's how I ruin myself," said old Joe. "That's your limit. If you asked me for more money, I might regret being so generous and only give you half the amount you requested." "Please, Joe, open my package now," said the first woman. Joe got down on his knees to make it easier to open something. He untied many knots and then pulled out a big, heavy roll of something dark. Joe asked, "What's this called?" "Bed curtains?" "Ah," said the woman, laughing and leaning forward with her arms crossed. "Bed curtains?" Joe asked, "Did you take them down, including the rings, while he was lying there?" The woman answered, "Yes, I do." "Why not?" Joe said, "You were born to make money, and you will definitely succeed. I won't help that man, even if I could easily grab anything with my hand." "I promise you, Joe," said the woman calmly. "Be careful not to spill the oil on the blankets." "His blankets?" asked Joe. "Do you think they belong to someone else?" the woman answered. "He probably won't catch a cold without them, I think. I hope he didn't die from anything contagious, right?" said old Joe, pausing in his task and gazing upward. The woman said, "Don't be scared of that. I don't like him so much that I would waste my time looking for those things even if he did. You can search through that shirt as much as you want, but you won't find any holes or worn-out spots. It's the best shirt he had, and it's really nice. They would have thrown it away if it wasn't for me." Old Joe asked, "What do you call it when you waste it?" "He was given a calico dress to be buried in, but I removed it," said the woman, laughing. "It's not good enough for anything if it's not good enough for this purpose. Calico looks just as nice on the body. He couldn't have looked any worse than he did in that dress." Scrooge was really scared as he listened to the conversation. He saw them sitting together with their stolen goods in the dim light from the old man's lamp. Scrooge felt a strong hatred and disgust towards them, as if they were disgusting creatures selling the dead body itself. The woman laughed and said, "Ha, ha," when old Joe took out a bag of money and showed how much they had earned. She said, "This is how it ends. He scared people away when he was alive, but now that he's dead, we get to benefit. Ha, ha, ha." "Oh no," said Scrooge, feeling scared all over his body. "I understand now. The situation of this unhappy man could happen to me too. My life seems to be heading in that direction. Dear God, what is happening?" He was very scared and moved back quickly because the scene had changed. He was now very close to a bed that had no curtains and had only a ragged sheet covering something up. Even though it couldn't speak, he could tell that something terrible was lying beneath the sheet. The room was very dark, too dark to see well. However, Scrooge looked around it because he felt like he should. He wanted to know what kind of room it was. There was a faint light coming from outside, which shone directly on the bed. On the bed was the body of a man who had been robbed and left alone. Nobody was watching over him or crying for him. Scrooge looked at the ghost. Its hand was pointing to its head and was steady. The cover was not properly placed, and if Scrooge lifted it a little or touched it with his finger, he could see the ghost's face. He thought about it and wanted to see it, but he couldn't because he didn't have the power to do so, just like he couldn't make the ghost leave. "Oh Death, please come here and bring all the fears and horrors you have at your command. This is your kingdom. But you cannot change anything about the loved, respected, and honored person. You cannot make them look bad. It's not just that their body will become heavy and still, but it's also that they were kind, brave, and generous. Their heart was warm and tender, and their life was full of good deeds. Go ahead, Death, strike them. And you'll see how their good deeds will continue to give life to the world even after they're gone." Scrooge didn't hear anyone say these words, but he still heard them when he saw the bed. He wondered, if this man could come back to life right now, what would he think about first? Would he think about his love of money, his harshness, and his worries about it? It seems like those things led him to a wealthy but unhappy ending. He was lying alone in a dark and empty house. No one, not a man, woman, or child, was there to acknowledge his kindness towards them. But he still held on to the memory of a single kind word and vowed to be kind to that person in return. A cat was scratching at the door, and there were rats chewing under the fireplace. Scrooge didn't know why they were in the room of death or why they seemed so unsettled and agitated. He was too afraid to think about it. "Oh, Spirit," he said, "this place is very scary. But I will not forget its lesson when we leave. Let's go, believe me." The ghost still pointed to the head with a steady finger. "I get you," said Scrooge. "And I would do it if I could. But I don't have the ability, Spirit. I don't have the ability." Again it seemed to look upon him. Scrooge, feeling distressed, said, "If anyone in this town is affected by the man's death, please show me that person, Spirit. I'm begging you." The phantom opened its dark cloak in front of him briefly, like a wing. Then he put it away and showed a room that was bright with daylight. In the room, there was a mother with her children. She was waiting for someone with a lot of worry and excitement. She paced back and forth in the room, got startled by every noise, checked outside from the window, looked at the clock, tried to sew but couldn't concentrate, and found it difficult to tolerate her children's noise while they played. Finally, after waiting for a while, someone knocked on the door. She quickly went to the door and saw her husband. He was a young man with a tired and sad face. However, his face now had a unique expression. It was a mixture of happiness and seriousness, which he tried to hide because he felt embarrassed. He sat down to eat dinner that had been saved for him by the fire. After a long silence, she asked him weakly if he had any news. He seemed unsure of how to respond and looked embarrassed. She asked, "Is it good or bad to assist him?" "Bad," he answered. "We are quite ruined?" "No. There is hope yet, Caroline." "I'm amazed," she said. "There is hope if he changes his mind. Anything can happen if he decides to change." "He won't change his mind," said her husband. "He has passed away." She was a kind and calm person, if her facial expressions were honest. She felt grateful inside and expressed it by holding her hands together. She quickly asked for forgiveness and felt regretful for her previous outburst, but her initial reaction came from the depth of her heart. "Last night, I told you about a woman who was a little drunk. When I spoke to her and asked for a week's delay, she told me something that I thought was just an excuse to not see me. However, it turns out that what she said was completely true. He was not just very sick, but actually dying. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know. But, by the time it happens, we will have the money ready. And even if we don't, it would be very unlucky to have a creditor as merciless as the current one in his successor. We can sleep peacefully tonight, Caroline." Yes. Even though they tried to hide it, their hearts felt better. The kids' faces, quiet and gathered together to listen to something they didn't really understand, were happier, and the house was a more cheerful place because of the man's passing. The only feeling that the ghost revealed to him about the situation was a sense of joy. Scrooge said, "Show me some kindness associated with a death, or else I will always remember that gloomy room we just left, spirit." The ghost led him through some streets that he knew well, and as they walked, Scrooge searched for himself, but he couldn't find himself anywhere. They arrived at Bob Cratchit's house, where he had been before, and saw the mother and children sitting by the fire. It was very quiet. The Cratchit children, who usually made a lot of noise, were sitting silently in a corner and looking at Peter, who was reading a book. The mother and her daughters were busy sewing. They were all so quiet. And he picked up a child and placed him in the middle of them. Scrooge wondered where he had heard those words before. He knew he had not dreamed them. He thought the boy must have said them aloud when he and the spirit walked through the door. Scrooge was confused as to why the boy didn't continue speaking. The mom put her work on the table and covered her face with her hand. "The color hurts my eyes," she said. "The color? Ah, poor Tiny Tim." "They are feeling better now," said Cratchit's wife. "Reading by candlelight can make their eyes weak, and I wouldn't want your father to see weak eyes when he comes home. He should be coming home soon." "Never mind that," Peter replied, closing his book. "But I've noticed that our father has been walking a bit slower than usual during the last few evenings, Mom." They were silent once more. Finally, she spoke in a calm and cheerful tone, although her voice trembled briefly. "I have seen him walk very quickly with Tiny Tim on his shoulder." "And so have I," cried Peter. "Often." "Me too," said someone else excitedly. Everyone else had also done it. He was easy to carry, she continued, focusing on her work, and his father loved him so much that it wasn't a problem at all. No problem. And look, your father is at the door. She quickly went outside to meet him, and little Bob, wrapped up in a warm scarf because he needed it, came in. His tea was prepared for him on the stove, and everyone tried to assist him with it. Next, the two young Cratchits climbed onto his lap, and each child rested a cheek against his face, as if to say, "Don't worry, Father. Don't be sad." Bob was really happy with them and talked nicely to everyone in the family. He saw the work on the table and said good things about how hard Mrs. Cratchit and the girls were working. He said they would finish the work well before Sunday. "Today is Sunday. Did you go out today, Robert?" asked his wife. "Yes, my dear," said Bob. "I wish you could have come with me. It would have been good for you to see how green it is. But you'll see it again. I promised to go there on a Sunday." "Oh, my little child!" Bob exclaimed. "My little child!" He suddenly became very emotional and started crying. He couldn't control his feelings. If he could have controlled them, he and his child may have been further away from each other than they currently were. He exited the room and went upstairs to the room above, which was bright and decorated for Christmas. Next to the child, there was a chair, and it appeared that someone had been there recently. Bob, feeling sad, sat in the chair and took some time to think and calm down. Finally, he kissed the child's face and came to terms with what had happened. He went back downstairs feeling content. They sat around the fire and talked while the girls and mother continued to work. Bob shared a story about Mr. Scrooge's nephew who had shown him extraordinary kindness. Bob had only met him once before, and when they ran into each other on the street that day, Mr. Scrooge's nephew noticed that Bob looked a little down. He asked Bob what had happened to make him feel that way. Bob said that he told him what was bothering him, and Mr. Scrooge's nephew was very kind and sympathetic. Bob said that Mr. Scrooge's nephew is the nicest person he has ever met. Bob also mentioned that he was surprised that Mr. Scrooge's nephew knew about his personal situation. "Knew what, my dear?" "Because you were a good wife," answered Bob. "Everybody knows that," said Peter. "Great observation, my boy," exclaimed Bob. "I hope they do." He said he was very sorry for your good wife. "If there is anything I can do to help you," he said, giving me his card, "come and see me." We found his kindness quite delightful, not so much for what he might do for us, but for his friendly manner. It felt as if he knew our Tiny Tim and shared our feelings. Bob exclaimed. "Mrs. Cratchit said, 'I'm sure he's a good person.'" "You would be confident, my friend," said Bob, "if you met and talked to him." "I wouldn't be shocked. Remember what I'm saying. If he found Peter a better job." "Listen to that, Peter," Mrs. Cratchit said. Then, one of the girls exclaimed, "Peter will be with someone and starting his own life." "Go away," Peter said with a smile. Bob said, "It might happen, or it might not happen one day. But don't worry, my dear. We still have a lot of time left. Regardless of how and when we say goodbye to each other, I'm sure none of us will forget about poor Tiny Tim, or this first time we said goodbye to each other. Never, Father, cried they all. Bob said, I know, my dears, that when we remember how patient and gentle Tiny Tim was, even though he was a little child, we will not argue with each other easily and forget about poor Tiny Tim while doing so. No, never, Dad, they all shouted again. I am very happy, said little Bob. I am very happy can be rewritten in simpler English as, little Bob said, I'm really happy. I'm really happy. Mrs. Cratchit gave him a kiss, his daughters gave him a kiss, the two young Cratchits gave him a kiss, and Peter and he shook hands. Tiny Tim, your innocent spirit came from God. Scrooge said, Spectre, I feel like it's time for us to say goodbye. I don't know why, but I just have this feeling. Can you please tell me who the man was that we saw dead? The ghost of Christmas yet to come took him to a different time, but it was unclear when. They went to where business people gather, but the ghost didn't show Scrooge himself. They only went straight to the future without stopping, until Scrooge asked the ghost to stay for a moment. Scrooge said, This is the court we're rushing through now. I work here, and I've been working here for a long time. I can see my house. Let me see what I'll look like in the future. The ghost or entity came to a halt, the hand that was indicating something moved to a different direction. Simplified, the ghost stopped and pointed its hand in a different direction. Scrooge said, The house is over there. Why are you pointing in a different direction? The unstoppable finger did not change. Scrooge quickly went to the window of his office and looked inside. It was still an office, but it wasn't his office anymore. The furniture was different, and the person sitting in the chair wasn't him. The ghost pointed in the same way as before. He joined it again, and wondered where and why he had gone. They went together until they reached a gate made of iron. He stopped and looked around before going inside. A cemetery. Here, the unhappy man, whose name he needed to know, was buried underground. It was a respectable location. Surrounded by buildings, covered in grass and weeds that grew from dead plants, not living ones, filled with too many burials, full from excessive consumption. A respectable location. The ghost was standing near the graves and indicating one of them. The person walked towards it while feeling scared. The ghost looked exactly the same as before, but the person was afraid that there was a new significance to its serious appearance. Scrooge said, Before I come closer to the stone you're showing me, please answer one question. Are these shadows showing things that will definitely happen, or are they just showing things that could happen? The ghost continued to point down towards the grave next to it. Men's paths will show where they will end up, and if they continue on that path, they will reach that end, said Scrooge. But if they change their path, the end will also change. This is what you are showing me, isn't it? The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge walked slowly and fearfully towards the grave. He followed the pointing finger and saw his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge, written on the neglected tombstone. He was shaking with fear as he read it. On my knees, I am asking, am I the man who was lying on the bed?" he cried. The finger came from the grave and pointed at him, and then it went back to the grave again. "No, spirit! Oh no, no!" The finger still was there. "Listen, spirit," he shouted, holding onto its robe tightly. "I am different now than I used to be. This encounter has changed me, and I don't want to be the same person I would have been without it. Why are you showing me this if there's no hope for me?" The hand seemed to shake for the first time. "Good spirit," he said as he fell to the ground before it, "you are kind and compassionate. Please tell me that I can still change the bad things you have shown me by living a better life." The kind hand trembled. "I'll celebrate Christmas in my heart and try to keep that feeling all year long. I'll live in the past, present, and future. The spirits of all three will be present within me. I won't ignore the lessons they teach me. Please, tell me I can erase what's written on this stone." He was in pain and grabbed the ghostly hand. The hand tried to escape, but he held onto it tightly. The spirit was even stronger and pushed him away. He raised his hands and prayed one last time to change his fate. Then he noticed that the phantom's hood and clothes were changing. They became smaller, fell apart, and turned into a bedpost.